You're leaking data through Copilot Studio right now, and you don't even know it. Yes, while everyone cheers about how their new AI assistant can fetch, summarize, and automate, that same friendly chatbot may also be gleefully indexing your board meeting notes and finance spreadsheets. It's not malicious, it's obedient, painfully obedient. Copilot Studio agents inherit the same permissions you have, which means if you can see the CEO's compensation file, so can your chatbot. Congratulations, you've built an omniscient intern running at the speed of Azure. And yet people talk about Copilot security like it's a solved mystery. Spoiler alert, it isn't. Your AI agents are extensions of the user identity, not separate beings with guardrails. They borrow your access token and run around your data estate doing precisely what you told them not to, except you didn't actually tell them not to because you never configured the data loss prevention rules that act as their leash. So here's the deal. In the next few minutes, you'll learn how to stop that leak, how to apply Power Platform DLP policies so your Copilot agents don't accidentally hand over sensitive data like a chatty intern misplacing the company credit card. We'll dissect why Copilot agents overreach, how to control data flows through connectors, and what Microsoft's consent model really allows behind the curtain. And there's one particular DLP rule, ignored by roughly 9 out of 10 administrators, that quietly separates safe organizations from headline material. By the end, you'll know the fix, and you'll have no excuse left. Let's uncover what your Copilot knows that it shouldn't. The hidden problem. Agents that know too much. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Your Copilot Studio agent isn't a colleague, it's you, duplicated in silicon. It doesn't ask whether it's supposed to retrieve that SharePoint file or peek into that Dataverse table, it just does it, because those are your permissions. And most admins forget that in Microsoft's ecosystem, identity replication equals privilege replication. The agent is essentially an obedient clone granted access through your security context, yet it possesses none of your discretion. Now, Copilot Studio binds these capabilities through connectors, Outlook, Dataverse, SharePoint, Teams, and every other integration your Power Platform tenant allows. Each connector acts like a tunnel dug between your data sources and this AI assistant. The more tunnels you open, the more your agent can wander. It's convenient, intoxicating even, until that same agent happily summarizes confidential HR documents because someone typed what were last quarter's hiring patterns, the digital equivalent of a caffeine-charged intern speed-reading the employee folder. The real paradox? Microsoft actually provides guardrails, data loss prevention policies. DLP was supposed to be the bouncer at the door, separating business-critical data from non-business chaos. Yet, in most deployments, those guardrails stop 2 floors below Copilot's operating space. Users assume their tenant-level policies automatically cascade, but Copilot agents live somewhere between a Power Platform environment and your tenant boundary, a shadow zone of governance where nothing technically breaks, but everything quietly goes wrong. Consider this. You configure Outlook and SharePoint connectors as business and some external API as non-business. That separation, if enforced properly, stops data from flowing between categories. But your Copilot agent, sitting within an underscoped environment, ends up executing across both because no one linked its environment to the right DLP set. Suddenly, your business data gets piped through a non-business connection. It's like having a secure vault with the door open because your security policy only guarded the lobby. Common failure paths all trace back to the same oversight. 1. Agents summarize or paraphrase information pulled from confidential lists. 2. They merge disparate sources in a single conversation, unintentionally violating data classifications. 3. Admins presume policy inheritance. But since Copilot agents are deployed inside environments with unique DLP boundaries, that inheritance never occurs. The miracle assumption that Microsoft does the governance work for you, it doesn't. If your Copilot can see finance data, congratulations. So, can every well-meaning employee who opens a chatbot session and starts probing for budget details? That's the silent breach vector. Internal exposure without malicious intent. No hacker required, just overly generous permissions and a lack of context isolation. It's the kind of breach that doesn't make headlines until someone exports a chat transcript. So before panicking or blaming Microsoft, look at your architecture. Your agent isn't breaking rules, it's following them precisely. You just never defined the right ones. DLP doesn't automatically apply across every layer. It has to be scoped, enforced, and tested per environment. And guess what? Copilot Studio agents live in development environments by default, the ones you probably never hardened, because it's just testing. We've established the symptom, agents that know too much. Now, to patch the leak, we need to map where data actually travels inside Copilot Studio, from user to connector to conversation log, because you can't block a river until you understand its current. So let's dissect that flow next. Before your polite little chatbot accidentally writes your annual forecast into a team chat it should never have joined. How data flows through Copilot Studio? Let's follow the trail of your data because unlike you, it doesn't take a coffee break. The moment a user initiates a conversation with a Copilot Studio agent, several gears start turning in the background. First comes the user identity, authenticated via Entra ID. That identity carries delegated permissions, which essentially say, everything I can see, you can too. The agent then pulls those credentials through a connector, which is the logical bridge to your data source. SharePoint, Outlook, Dataverse, or any other service available in that environment. Once it retrieves the data, the output doesn't vanish. It travels through layers: conversation context, generated response, and finally, analytics storage for logging and insight. A lovely little data relay race, except the button is your confidential information. Now, at every step of that relay, there are weak links. The connector is the first risk zone. Connectors in Power Platform come in 3 types: standard, typical Microsoft services; premium, third-party or enhanced functionality; and custom user-defined APIs. Each type is governed differently. Standard connectors fall neatly within the built-in DLP categories. Premium and custom connectors, however, often float in regulatory limbo until you assign them a classification. When admins neglect that, Copilot agents treat them all as fair game. Imagine labeling half your filing cabinets top secret while leaving the rest blank. You've just given the intern permission to open whatever looks interesting. The second weak point lies in system connectors. These aren't visible in the maker's canvas, but quietly enable functions like Teams messaging or adaptive card rendering. Because they're technically system-owned, not user-owned, they often evade your DLP filters. Think of them as maintenance tunnels running beneath your castle. Rarely patrolled, always open. When data moves through them, most organizations never notice. By default, Microsoft excludes several connectors from policy enforcement to preserve basic functionality. Wonderful for uptime, terrible for isolation. Then there's the conversation log, Copilot's chat history stored for analytics, debugging, and continuous improvement. Many assume that disabling telemetry turns this off. It doesn't. Conversation data can persist in the environment's analytics store, meaning a prompt that references sensitive financial metrics might remain in your logs indefinitely unless retention is configured. You can already sense the compliance department shivering. Here's where data flow becomes deceptively complex. A single Copilot call may touch multiple connectors in sequence. For example, an agent could use Outlook to extract recent emails, pass that content through a text analytics connector, and return summaries in Teams. Each step crosses a DLP boundary. If even one of those connectors belongs to a different classification, say Outlook as business and cognitive services as non-business, the entire flow violates policy. The system doesn't scream, it simply proceeds. Cross-connection is silent but catastrophic. What's worse, DLP policies are environment-scoped, not tenant-wide, meaning each Power Platform environment has its own boundaries. Unless you explicitly replicate policies, every new environment becomes a potential leak. You can have immaculate governance in production and absolute chaos in development. And Microsoft will politely remind you, if asked, that environment isolation is by design. Translation: your problem. Let me share a cautionary tale. A client deployed a financial Copilot agent in a testing environment, assuming their global DLP policy applied automatically. The agent, joyfully unaware of hierarchy, had access to both internal SharePoint libraries and an experimental third-party API. When legal reviewed a sample chat log, they discovered confidential quarterly numbers threaded into an API conversation. No intrusion, no hack, just policy absence. The system behaved exactly as configured, to do everything wrong. By now, you can visualize the anatomy of a leak. Identity delegates power, connectors bridge data, conversation logs preserve traces, analytics snapshot the event. Miss one boundary and information trickles across. So before we erect defenses, remember this flow: user, connector, agent, log, analytics. Every arrow is a potential escape route. Next, we'll build walls, DLP policies strong enough to contain even the most over-enthusiastic Copilot. Building the DLP Fortress, the right setup. Most admins mildly panic here. Good. Panic means you finally realized your agents aren't innocent. They're unsupervised toddlers with access to the corporate vault. So let's start rebuilding this fortress properly from the ground up, because creating a DLP policy in Power Platform isn't hard. Understanding what it actually controls takes more finesse than most documentation admits. First, identify your battleground, the environments hosting Copilot Studio projects. Many organizations spin up multiple Power Platform environments: development, test, production, often by enthusiastic citizen developers who think environment sounds like a sandbox for creativity. It is not. Each environment is its own security island. Policies you set at the tenant level don't automatically fence these islands, meaning your prod environment might be governed like Fort Knox while dev floats like a raft in the Pacific. Step 1, therefore, is reconnaissance. Find every environment where someone clicked Create Copilot. Assume nothing is harmless. Now we build the first wall. Inside the Power Platform Admin Center, open the Data Policies section and create a new data loss prevention policy. You'll be asked to define affected environments. Select them deliberately. Scattering policies across unused spaces just breeds inconsistency. Each policy enforces at deployment time, not retroactively, so every new or existing connector within that environment will comply only after the policy is published. Next comes the cornerstone of DLP, connector categorization. Picture 3 buckets labeled business, non-business, and blocked. Every connector from Outlook to custom HTTP calls falls into one. Business connectors may share data freely among themselves. Non-business connectors can share only among their own group. Blocked connectors are quarantined entirely. That's the hierarchy your AI must obey. And yes, misplacing one connector between groups can turn a secure chatbot into a gossip columnist. Now isolate the high-risk group, AI and external connectors. Anything labeled cognitive services, OpenAI, or generic HTTP should default to non-business or blocked. These connectors act as outbound gateways where data leaves Microsoft's walled garden and enters a realm of third-party processing. Blocking them doesn't cripple your Copilot, it disciplines it. You can still build intelligent flows, just without handing raw customer data to whichever endpoint happens to respond first. Then we address the silent killer, cross-connection. This occurs when a single conversation or flow touches both a business and non-business connector. Example, an agent retrieves a SharePoint list, business, then sends that summary to an external language API, non-business. Even if each connector is individually allowed, that junction creates a data bridge your policy forbids. Power Platform's DLP enforcement automatically blocks such flows if you've categorized connectors correctly. Otherwise, it shrugs and proceeds. Verify your groupings, one false classification, and the guards let the thief walk out politely. The DLP hierarchy itself works like a stack of nested shields. At the top, tenant-level policies override everything below. Beneath that, environment-level policies govern specific spaces. Finally, individual app or agent restrictions apply only within their environment scope. Think of it as management hierarchy. Tenant rules are corporate law, environment rules are departmental policy, and app-level settings are sticky notes on cubicles. If contradictions occur, corporate law wins. So when in doubt, enforce strict defaults at the tenant boundary, then narrow exceptions downward. Do not trust app makers to police themselves. They're the same people who thought putting Power Automate in production without version control was acceptable. Before you celebrate, test everything in a sandbox environment. Always. Copilot Studio agents rely on multiple implicit connections, and your shiny new policy might block them silently, breaking core features. Deploy your DLP adjustments to a test environment, import a sample agent, and confirm it still answers routine queries. If not, adjust connector groupings until functionality returns without widening exposure. You're balancing usability and paranoia. Slightly on the side of paranoia. It's cheaper than litigation. Notice what we just did. We separated the data, defined the borders, and sealed off the exits. That's your fortress: rigid categories, scoped environments, layered hierarchy, tested walls. But even the best fortress needs guards who understand permissions, because fortifications fail the moment someone hands out a master key. And in Microsoft's kingdom, those keys are issued through Entra ID. So, now that your walls are tall and your moat is full, let's talk about the gatekeepers, those charming delegated permissions that make every admin feel falsely secure. Enter Entra and the not-so-magical permission model. Permissions, Entra, and the myth of safety. If I had $1 for every time someone said, "It's Entra, so it's secure," I'd have enough to buy Microsoft stock and fix the problem myself. Let's dismantle this myth properly. Entra, the artist formerly known as Azure Active Directory, does not sprinkle pixie dust on your identity just because it handles authentication. It is a broker, not a guardian. And your Copilot agent, cute as it may appear, does not possess its own account, password, or conscience. It borrows yours. This is called delegated permissions. When you sign in and interact with a Copilot agent, that agent requests an access token on your behalf. That token includes every permission granted to you through your Microsoft 365 environment. SharePoint library? Check. Dataverse table? Check. Private Teams chat with your boss? Also check if you happen to have that access. The agent doesn't distinguish between important and catastrophic. It simply executes with your scope under your identity. If you have financial privileges, then so does your algorithmic assistant, and no, it won't hesitate to use them. Now, this design works beautifully inside controlled scopes because it keeps user experiences seamless. But the danger comes from implicit consent. When you approve a connector, say for Outlook or Dataverse, that consent is stored within the environment. Any Copilot agent hosted there inherits that trust. Approve it once, and you've effectively blessed every future agent with the same reach. Congratulations, you've deployed a family of omnipotent chatbots without individual supervision. If that sounds reckless, it's because it is. The antidote lies in implementing least privilege access for your agents, just as you, hopefully, do for humans. Inside Entra ID, build custom security groups and role assignments that limit what Copilot-related components can query. For instance, restrict access to only the subset of data connectors necessary for each agent's function. A marketing assistant has no reason to query HR records, yet many admins lump them into identical scopes for convenience. Convenience breeds exposure. Unless you enjoy explaining data lineage to auditors, stop doing that. What about managed identities? Yes, they exist, and yes, they're useful. A managed identity lets an application authenticate with Azure resources using its own service principle instead of piggybacking on yours. But here's the subtlety most miss. Copilot Studio agents primarily run on user delegation, not managed identities. Assigning managed identities hastily can lead to overprivilege, because those service principles often start with broader Azure permissions than you intended. Treat managed identities as surgical instruments, not default toggles. Automation does not equal autonomy. You might be thinking, fine, I'll just rely on auditing. Excellent attitude, as long as you actually do it. Entra provides sign-in logs and app consent reports that reveal which service principals accessed what resource, under whose identity, and when. Combine that with Power Platform Admin Center analytics, and you can trace connector activity per agent. If you ever spot a connector pulling data outside its designated environment, that's not curiosity. It's configuration laziness made visible. Capture those events, export to your monitoring platform, and act on them. Trust but verify is outdated. In the Copilot era, it's restrict and confirm. So no, Entra alone does not secure your agents. It authenticates them politely, efficiently, and indifferently. Security is the architecture wrapped around identity, not the existence of it. Your walls, DLP, your keys, permissions, and your guards, auditing, form a triad. Break one leg and the entire structure tilts. The myth of safety dies the moment you realize Microsoft delegated the responsibility right back to you. You asked for self-service AI. They delivered precisely that, self-service everything. And that includes self-inflicted leaks. Now that we've tightened identity and restricted scope, don't congratulate yourself yet. A policy written but never tested is the bureaucratic version of a placebo. You need evidence, proof that your fortress actually holds under pressure. That means poking, provoking, and occasionally trying to break your own system. Because if you won't, someone else, accidentally or otherwise, eventually will. Testing and monitoring. Prove it's sealed. Testing a Copilot agent isn't about watching it answer hello correctly. It's about seeing what happens when you challenge it with questions that should hit security walls. You start by red teaming your Copilot, not with dramatic hacker theatrics, but with deliberate, controlled prompts. Ask for confidential data it shouldn't access, summarize executive salaries, export all customer records, or show me contracts stored in finance. If the agent politely declines or throws an access restriction, celebrate briefly. If it complies, you've just uncovered the precise hole attackers dream of. This method isn't hypothetical testing, it's applied governance. Build a catalog of forbidden prompts and run them against each Copilot environment. Track responses. A refusal indicates that DLP and permission layers are functioning. A data spill signals misclassification or connector overlap. The beauty of Copilot is its transparency. Logs capture everything. The horror is that those logs also preserve your mistakes. So next, monitor connector usage analytics. In Power Platform Admin Center, open the Environment Analytics pane. You'll find metrics on connector volume, frequency, and user origin. Look for anomalies. Spikes in HTTP connector calls from agents that were never supposed to use external APIs, or sudden surges in SharePoint queries aligned with new chatbot deployments. These aren't coincidences, they're breadcrumbs of poor configuration. Treat them like forensic clues. Every anomaly reflects a missing control somewhere upstream. Then comes audit logging, your proof trail. Enable audit events in Power Platform and sync them with Microsoft Purview or Microsoft Sentinel. This ensures every action, prompt, and connector call gets indexed into your wider compliance fabric. With Purview, you gain context. Which datasets were touched, which user initiated the prompt, and whether data left your geographic boundary. Sentinel, on the other hand, adds correlation, linking these activities to broader security events like unusual sign-ins or privilege escalations. Together, they transform invisible AI behavior into measurable telemetry. An overlooked rule here, retention alignment. Audit data often outlives conversation data. If you purge chat logs after 30 days but keep audit events for a year, you lose the contextual thread that explains why an event occurred. Policy enforcement without context is useless. Ensure retention policies across Copilot logs, analytics, and audit traces remain in sync so your evidence actually tells a coherent story. Now, periodic reclassification ranks among the most ignored tasks. Microsoft updates connector definitions constantly. A formerly safe standard connector might become premium or external overnight, changing its data behavior. Review connector inventory every quarter. Reclassify according to current Microsoft documentation, not last year's assumption. Neglecting this is equivalent to locking your doors while someone quietly moves the hinges. Finally, adopt continuous governance. Every new connector, plugin, or third-party extension reopens the risk surface. Treat DLP not as a static compliance checkbox, but as an evolving perimeter. schedule quarterly audits, automate analytics exports, and feed alerts to your security information and event management pipeline. Governance dies the moment it's manual. When you finish testing, you'll notice something satisfying. The goal isn't compliance and never was. It's control. A Copilot agent that only answers within guarded boundaries becomes predictable, manageable, and genuinely safe for business use. That's when AI shifts from liability to asset, but only because you made paranoia systemic, not optional. Once your data stops leaking, you'll view Copilot Studio differently, not as a shiny toy for productivity, but as an instrument of trust engineering. Your agents behave because you built the rules that way. And that's how you can finally say, without irony, that your environment is sealed. Copilot Studio agents aren't villains, they're reflections. They behave exactly as your configuration instructs, which is usually to overshare politely. Every permission they exploit, every connector they cross, and every dataset they expose is ultimately a mirror of your governance. You built the bridge, they just walked across it. So remember this, a Copilot agent is only as trustworthy as its DLP configuration, nothing more. Security through optimism is not a strategy. Security through enforced boundaries is. Governance, therefore, isn't optional when your AI can query SharePoint, Dataverse, and Outlook with executive authority. The seductive part of Copilot is convenience. Ask and it obeys. The dangerous part is that obedience extends to confidential spreadsheets and HR data when no one tells it otherwise. The only real fix is discipline. Classify connectors, restrict permissions, and test those restrictions until failure becomes impossible. Do it before another harmless pilot project turns into a compliance investigation. Lock your data before your Copilot learns too much. Think of DLP as intellectual containment, not bureaucracy, a set of digital walls keeping intelligence from mutating into exposure. Once you enforce these rules, your Copilot stops being a liability and starts being what it was advertised as, a trustworthy assistant. If this saved your compliance team a panic attack, subscribe. It's cheaper than an audit and infinitely less awkward than explaining to legal why a chatbot posted payroll data in Teams. Follow for the next episode, Advanced Copilot Agent Governance with Microsoft Purview, and keep your automations clever, contained, and absolutely under control.